Is your garden big enough to feed your family? When it comes to garden planning, one of the hardest things is choosing what to grow, but maybe harder is choosing how many plants to grow, especially when you're trying to feed your family. Join me today as I help answer that question of how many vegetable plants to grow. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and while I would like to be able to say grow 5 bean plants per person and 3 cucumber plants per person and 5 tomato plants per person, it's not that simple. There are many factors involved when deciding how many vegetable plants to grow. I've done some research and looked at a lot of different sources to try to find out if there are some numbers that are common when it comes to recommending how many plants to grow. And what I found is there's not a lot of commonality. And I think it's because of why we're growing the plants for food, and what kind of diet we have, and how much space we have in our garden. I'll be discussing all of those factors and more, and give you some suggestions of what I think may be suitable numbers. But let's go inside to do that planning. It's below freezing in my garden right now, which is why today's a good day to be inside developing this plan for planting. Now, I've already figured out what food crops I'm going to grow this year and what food crops I'm not going to grow this year. And if I can figure out how many seeds I need and how many seeds I'm going to plant, come sowing day, it's a piece of cake to just put that number of seeds in the beds that I've chosen to grow them in. If you wait until that day in springtime or early summer to sow your seeds and then decide, do I put 3? Do I put 7? Do I do 15? Well, you're definitely behind the 8 ball. So get ahead of it and start planning. And as you look at the different recommendations from the different sources, there is some agreement. Something like artichoke. Almost everybody agrees that you should grow 1 to 2 artichoke plants per person, if artichokes are a normal part of your diet, and if you have room to grow that many artichoke plants. Artichokes grow pretty big, and so as you're putting together your list and deciding what to grow and how many plants to grow, recognize the size of the mature plant, and that may influence the final number that you decide upon. When it comes to artichokes, I would love to grow at least 1 to 2 plants, but they don't grow well in my Colorado garden. So there's another consideration. You may want to grow a crop, and recommendation is to grow that crop, but if it doesn't match your specific region, your climate for that plant, then you're wasting time and you're wasting space. So when you choose your plants, make sure you're taking those kind of considerations into account. When I show you my list of how many plants I think a typical gardener should grow in their garden, recognize that it is a range, and it will be determined by the space in your garden and how many plants you eat in a typical week. Let's start with carrots, for instance. I've seen recommendations to grow 10 carrots per person in your garden, and I've seen recommendations to grow 30 carrots per person in your garden. If you have a family of 4, do you have space to grow 120 carrots? Or is it more likely that you have space to grow 32 carrots? That's a big factor. And so as you look at these ranges of how many plants to grow, think about the bed that you're going to grow these plants in, how much space each of these plants need, and if it matches your particular diet. Now, I don't eat a lot of carrots, but in any given year, I probably eat between 20 and 30 myself. And that's just a typical day with a typical diet. If you eat a lot of stews and you have a lot of carrots for snacking for the kids, and you've got the space in your garden, you might grow 50 or 60 carrots per person. This is where you have to decide how you modify these numbers and which ones are most important to you. Zucchini plants are a great example. All of us who have grown zucchinis know that they're very prolific and they give us a lot of that delicious fruit. The recommendations range from 1 per person to 3 plants per person. If you're a family of 4, think about how much space 12 zucchini plants are going to take, and then take that to the next step. How many zucchinis that those 12 plants are going to produce. I had 2 zucchini plants in my garden last year and grew more than 40 pounds of zucchini. So if you were to multiply that by a factor of 6, do you think you could use and store and preserve 250 pounds of zucchini? That becomes another important factor when you're growing these plants. What are you going to do with the plant after harvest? Let's go ahead and look at some of these suggested ranges, and then I'll break it down and give you what may be a more suitable suggestion for how many plants to grow. One to 5 tomato plants matches pretty closely what most gardeners do. If you're growing cherry tomatoes, I don't think you need 5 cherry tomato plants per person. You'll be drowned in cherry tomatoes. 1 cherry tomato plant per person is usually enough. If you like to make tomato sauce and tomato paste and lots of salsa, well, that's where the other tomato plants come into play. So you might have 1 cherry tomato plant per person, and maybe you'll have 2 or 3 paste plants per person, and then you have 1 of a nice beefsteak variety that you can eat fresh and slice up on a sandwich or in a salad. It all comes down to how you're using those tomatoes in the first place. This year, I'm planning on growing a lot of those paste tomatoes because I'm planning to do a lot of preservation. I'm going beyond that 1 to 5 tomato plants per person because I have a purpose. If you don't do that kind of preservation and you're only eating something like tomatoes when they're fresh, then you probably don't need as many plants. Imagine if you're only eating the tomatoes to slice into a sandwich or a salad, and you're growing 5 plants for every member of your family. You're going to be overloaded with tomatoes and have to give them away. So this is a great reason to figure out what you're going to do, learn about preservation, and then modify the number of plants you're growing based on whether you're planning to eat them fresh or whether you're planning to eat them in the future after you've preserved that harvest. Some plants freeze very, very well, which is why you might see such high numbers for plants like peas and beans and carrot and corn, because you can grow more than you would eat in a typical gardening season by freezing it and eating it later. There are other plants like asparagus that you see high numbers in, and that probably comes down to the reason that asparagus is only harvested during a very brief period in spring. So if you want to enjoy it for more than that brief period, you need to grow a lot of plants that you can then freeze and use over the course of a year. If you're not freezing, well, now start thinking about the plants that you can store well. And so you can see high numbers when growing plants like beets and rutabaga and turnip and parsnip, because those are the kind of root crops that will store for many months after harvest. Go ahead and modify your diet over the course of the year based on the plants that you're planning to grow. Go ahead and plan to eat some of the plants fresh. Go ahead and plan on eating some of those crops that have been stored. And go ahead and plan on eating some of the plants that have been preserved, usually by freezing. So now let me show you a revised list. This is the Gardner-Scott recommendation for how many plants to grow in your vegetable garden. And I'm taking into account the experience level of an average gardener, and I'm taking into account the preservation knowledge of an average gardener, and offering a suggestion based on the amount of space that a typical garden is going to have. As I've been saying all along, you need to modify based on your particular factors with diet and space and experience. So here's the Gardner-Scott list. Now, I am not suggesting that you grow all of those plants in the quantity that I suggested. What I'm saying is, if you choose to grow those plants and you're growing them for food for your family, then that quantity should be enough to make you happy. If it's not enough, grow more next year. If you have too much, grow less next year. The beauty of the recommendations as far as how many plants to grow, it's a baseline, and you're the one that gets to modify it in the future to match what works best for you. So take my list, take the earlier ranges that are recommended and modify them for your garden. Use your garden journal to track that kind of information. And like me, go ahead and come up with a list that gives you a starting point for the years ahead. So on cold days like this, as I'm starting to figure out what I'm going to grow, I can go to the list that I've developed, go ahead and figure out how many seeds I need, and on sowing day, I'm all ready to go. For more information about planning and choosing crops, well, go ahead and watch one of these videos next. I'm Gardner Scott. Enjoy gardening.